A young boy wanted $100 very, very badly. And so he prayed and he asked God for $100, but nothing happened. He prayed again, asking God for $100, and still nothing. So he decided he would write a letter to God with his request. When the postal authorities received the letter addressed to God USA, they weren't sure what to do with it, so they delivered it to the president. The secretary, in opening the letter, shared the letter with the president. He smiled and instructed his secretary to send the boy $5. He figured this amount might be enough to encourage such a young boy. Well, the boy was delighted with his $5 bill. He sat down immediately to write a thank you note to God. The note said, "Dear God, thank you very much for sending the money. However, I noticed that for some reason you sent it through Washington, D.C., and those guys deducted $95 in taxes." Early lesson in the real world. Like this young boy, money is something we talk to God about a lot. Money is something that is on our minds often. Many songs are written about money. Pink Floyd wrote, "Money, get away, get a job with more pay, and you're okay. Grab that cash with both hands and make a stash. New car, caviar, 4-star daydream. Think I'll buy me a football team. Money." Or the deep song by the Beatles, "Now give me money. That's what I want. 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 Yeah, that's what I want." They made plenty of it, singing songs like that. Did it satisfy? Bing Crosby was asked once why he had such a calm, unruffled demeanor. And Bing reached into his pocket, he pulled out a wad of money, and he said, "Well, this helps." Really? Really? As someone put it, money's not everything, but it's way ahead of whatever's in second place. I read about a man of a certain clothing manufacturer who turned out thousands upon thousands of shirts with the words on it, "Money isn't everything." Money isn't everything. You know what happened? He eventually went bankrupt. I find that ironic. It's all dust in the wind. Nothing lasts forever but the earth and sky. It slips away, and all your money won't another minute buy. Everything is dust in the wind. That brings us to another one of Jesus' unforgettable stories. It's the last parable we're going to look at in this series on parables. And so look with me at Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12. It speaks to the haves and the have-nots. Interesting, last Sunday after I was done with the sermon, at the close of the service, I walked into one of these aisles and I stepped on someone's foot and I said, "Oh, sorry, I stepped on your toes." And someone else said, "You do that every single Sunday." It's not going to be any different this morning. This was a tough one. Our final parable from Luke 12 will help us get some perspective on handling our possessions. You know, it's critical that we think rightly about this matter of wealth and possessions. Because when the issue is reduced to riches and poverty, you end up with a prosperity gospel on the one hand and a poverty gospel at the other extreme. You see, you can't just take a few verses of the Bible, string them together, and say, if you love Jesus and you do these things, you will be rich. And neither can you pick out other verses from the Bible, string them together, and say, if you love Jesus, you should be poor. Well, let's look at Luke 12 for some help on this. We'll see this morning from Luke 12 the problem, the principle, the parable, and then the punchline. The problem, the principle, the parable, and then the punchline, or we might say the point of it all. But first of all, let's look at the presenting problem. The presenting problem. Now, all you teachers out there can appreciate this. It happens to preachers too. You teach your lesson, you give a sermon, and then when it's all said and done, one student says something that is so unrelated to what you just talked about that you wonder if they were even in the same room. Well, this is Jesus' experience right here. You see, in Luke 12, the scene is of Jesus surrounded by a crowd of people. Many thousands of people were gathered, verse 1 tells us. There were so many people that they were trampling on one another. And in these first 12 verses, Jesus has been talking about hypocrisy. He's been talking about fearing God rather than man. He talks about blasphemy of the Holy Spirit and the triune God. He speaks about forgiveness and salvation. Then out of the crowd comes a disgruntled man who wants Jesus to solve a family dispute. On the heels of that teaching, first 12 verses, we come to verse 13. It seems so out of the blue. Look at verse 13. Someone in the crowd said to him, to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." Now think about this. This guy has one shot to talk to Jesus. What subject does he pick? Money. He has this one chance to ask Jesus any question he wants to ask, and this is what he comes out with: how do I get more money? And it really isn't even a question. It's a statement demanding Jesus does something about his problem. And I find it interesting that this man isn't one bit embarrassed about his request. I mean, think about this. The two brothers had just lost their dad. And rather than mourning together over their loss of their loved one, they're fighting over who gets what and how much. First one wouldn't share. Second one demanded he get his hands on it. Now, how many of you have seen money destroy a family? How many of you have seen the ugliness around a family business or property belonging to the family or loaning of money to a family or an inheritance? As someone put it, you never know a person until you sit down next to him and hear the words, "I now read for you Mr. So-and-so's last will and testament." It all comes out. What was once, by all appearances, this nice little family turns into people taking sides and becoming contentious and jockeying for the most and arguing and seeking to get what they want. It's what I want. It's what I want. It's what I want. I mean, isn't it times like these that the heart is exposed? This guy really isn't that difficult to figure out. Jesus is about to peel away the layers. Jesus' answer to this man's demanding request is not cordial. Look what Jesus says, verse 14. He says, "Man," which is not a term of endearment, "man, who appointed me a judge or an arbiter between you?" He's not touching this one. Jesus was a man with purpose, and he wasn't going to get sidetracked by this trivial matter. He knew what was in a man, and the problem stated was superficial and a symptom of a spiritual issue. Now, perhaps this is a lesson for all of us, that even though we can't see into a man's heart as Jesus can, let's not get involved in matters that only take us away from the issues of the heart. The presenting problem often isn't the real issue. And Jesus moves from the presenting superficial problem to the universal principle. To the universal principle. Jesus turns to the crowd and he gives a strong warning. Look at verse 15. The first part of it. "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed." Now, one can only wonder what this man was thinking as he stood there listening to Jesus talk about greed. It's not where he saw this going. The root of the problem with these two brothers was greed. And greed has been the cause of many siblings not speaking to each other. It's been the cause of families just being ripped apart. Greed causes best of friends to be at each other's throats. Folks, greed is a horrendous sin. We don't always see it that way. I mean, we see it as sin, but not a serious sin. These are the serious ones. Then there's greed over here somewhere. And even in the evangelical church, we downplay it and we justify it. Because in our world, we call greed advertising. I mean, what's the whole point of advertising or marketing? It's to get you to covet, is it not? You thought you were content until you see that advertising of something you didn't know that you even needed. Remember years ago going, ooh, a car with heated seats. Didn't know they existed. They do. I need them now. Back many years ago, I had this basketball hoop that I would wheel out to the end of the driveway, and I loved that basketball hoop. You could adjust its height. It was easy to kind of move around, and I enjoyed many, many games with my kids and others of horse and one-on-one and 21 and pickup games around that hoop. It was a lot of fun. I loved that hoop. Then one day, my neighbor bought a basketball hoop. He set it up in his driveway. I noticed how his hoop had a clear shatter guard backboard with this steel frame. His hoop had this power lift adjustment to change the height of the hoop. I had to use a stick to adjust mine. You know what happened? In an instant, I didn't like my basketball hoop so much. I wanted that one. I was suddenly discontent. Amazing, isn't it? We lust over things we don't need, and then we go into debt to get it, to only find out 6 months later what? There's a new improved version. Yeah, we call that technology. So we're discontent again. When I think of the issue of never getting enough and always being discontent, I can't help but think of the scene in Little Shop of Horrors, the plant there that cries out, "Feed me, feed me." That's us. Feed me, feed me. Coveting, coveting, coveting. More, more, more. It's the American way. Notice the words of Jesus' warning in verse 15. Because he says, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Do you know what happens with a sermon like this? We go, yep, I know some greedy people. Yeah, I see it. I can give you some examples too, Pastor. I got some. They really need to deal with their greed. He says all kinds of greed. All kinds. Greed comes in many shapes and many forms. It comes to both the haves and the have-nots. So how do we guard our hearts against greed? Well, Jesus' warning in verse 15 is followed by some wisdom. It's a universal principle. Listen to this universal principle. Jesus says a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. Really? Now, when Jesus uses the word life here, it's not the word bios, meaning life, as opposed to death or a way of life. He uses a different word there. It's the word zoe, which means real life. It means satisfaction. It means fulfillment and enjoyment. He's speaking here to what encompasses all that makes life worth living. He's talking about the real substance and essence of life, and he says a man's life, essence of his life, does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. He's saying, even when you have abundance of stuff, that won't make life worth living. What's ingrained in us? What's the lie that we have bought? We've been told the one who dies with the most toys wins. We've been told that money does buy happiness. We've been told that just a little bit more would be enough. Jesus says a man's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions, and so often we live as though it does. Patrice Moore, a 43-year-old man living in the Bronx, New York, he lived in a reclusive life in a 10 by 10 foot room where he compulsively saved newspapers, magazines, books, catalogs, and junk mail. One day, all of that came crashing down on him, literally. An avalanche of Moore's stuff trapped him, get this, trapped him standing up in his room for 2 days before neighbors heard his moaning and they called the fire department, and neighbors and firefighters came to the rescue, and they hauled out 50 garbage bags of paper for an hour just to reach him. Oh, how easily we accumulate stuff. Let me state the principle this way. What you believe is important for a quality life will rule what you chase in life. What you believe is important for a quality life will rule what you chase in life. And with that principle, Jesus then tells him a story. In typical Jesus fashion, he doesn't come right out and call this man in the crowd a fool. He lets the story speak for itself. It's a story of a rich farmer. It is of a man who lives for himself, talks to himself, plans for himself, and congratulates himself. What's that saying? A person wrapped up in himself makes for a small package. And this big, successful farmer really was a small man, for he missed the point of life. So we go from the problem to the principle, and now to the parable. Follow along as I read verse 16. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. Now, the farmer in Jesus' story received what he had hoped for and likely worked hard for, an abundant crop. Every farmer hopes for a good crop. Every worker hopes for that raise. Every business owner hopes for that successful year. Every graduate hopes for that big break. Many people wait and hope for that winning number. I read this past week that nearly 1/3 of all Americans are counting on the lottery as their retirement income. Now, is it wrong to wish for a good crop? Is it wrong to be productive? Is it wrong to be successful? Well, only if it is gained through dishonesty or some other unrighteous way. Listen, don't simply think two categories here, rich, poor. That misses the point. If you want to think categories, think of 4 categories. You can be righteous and rich. You can be unrighteous and rich. Thirdly, you can be righteous and poor. And fourthly, you can be unrighteous and poor, or somewhere in the middle. See, it all comes back to what we will do with what we have. And with verse 16 and the story here comes opportunity. What will this man do with his opportunity of a good crop? Will he manage his resources well? Well, let's continue with the story. Verse 17. Verse 17 says he thought to himself. Now let's stop here for a second. Interesting, isn't it? This man is on the island of me. He has no one else to talk with than himself. Or if he does, he chooses to figure this out on his own. So he says to himself, verse 17, "What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops." Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I'll store all my grain and my goods. Verse 19, he's still talking to himself. "And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry." Now, where's Jesus going with all this? I mean, should we go home and burn our barns and garages to the ground? Should we move all our stuff from storage units? It isn't a sin to own a barn or a garage or a storage shed. It isn't a sin to make money. It isn't a sin to live in a decent home. It isn't a sin to have nice stuff. What's the real issue for this God? Anything stand out to you as I read verses 17 through 19? I mean, did you catch it here? This farmer, this man, he has eye problems. He has eye problems. I, my. This guy worshiped the Trinity of me, myself, and I. Let's count it. Verse 17. What shall I do? I have no place to store, here it is, my crops. 2 eyes, 1 my. Let's continue, verse 18. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and build bigger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. Verse 19, and I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. 6 eyes, 5 my's. 3 verses. What's wrong with this picture? It's the question we must all ask. Do we see ourselves as the center of our life? Do we really think it's all about us? This man never saw beyond himself. I, my, mine. Worship the Trinity of me, myself, and I. There was a story I used to read to Nicole when she was younger. It was called Buzzle Billy. Buzzle Billy had plenty of toys and plenty of friends to share those toys with. Then one day, Buzzle Billy developed a mine attitude. He began to shout, give me that! Give me that! And he developed a case of gimme hands. Each time he grabs for one of his toys, not to be shared with others, a hand pops out from his body. Each time he says, mine, another hand pops out. And these hands are popping out all over the place. It's a good thing our gimme hands aren't that noticeable to others, right? Or are they? The farmer had a bad case of gimme hands. He couldn't handle success. He got greedy. And so for this farmer, living life was defined in terms of ease and pleasure. And to him, life was obtained by putting oneself and one's wealth first. And those who die in the pursuit of living it up pursue a life wrongly defined. I ask you, what defines your life? What defines your life? What gives you significance and security? What do you really value? And parents, I say this to myself, our kids are taking in what really matters. They are observing. Remember a story of a mother who took her 5-year-old shopping, and all day long they went to many stores, one store after another, and then finally towards the end the clerk handed this little boy a lollipop. The mom said, now what do you say? And the boy replied, charge it. He'd heard it all day long. Now, if your discussions around the dinner table center mostly on money and the things it can buy, then it will become clear to your impressionable kids what you really value. It is clear what this farmer really values. And what happened to this farmer is what can happen to any one of us in this room, even sincere Christians. Because no one in this room is exempt from being seduced by money and possessions. We are all capable of compromising fruitfulness, forfeiting freedom, and surrendering peace at the altar of possessions. You see, coveting, greed, is not simply about having possessions. It is the loving of possessions, which results in obsessing over them and worshiping them. You know, in Colossians 3:5, we're told that greed is idolatry. Covetousness made God's top 10 list in the Old Testament. It's the 10th commandment. Before we come to the 10th commandment, do not covet. What do we come to first? Well, the first commandment is there's only one God. And the second commandment is, and we're to worship him alone. And as it's been noted, we put God first in our lives and we worship him alone, then we won't break the rest of the commandments. We worship God. If we're worshiping God, we will be content with all that God has given us, and we won't be coveting. You believe that? I mean, do I really believe that? I mean, can we worship God and covet at the same time? Impossible. So whatever it is that constitutes life for us becomes our God. Whatever becomes our God, it becomes that for which we will sacrifice all else. And at times, even relationships are sacrificed or compromised over possessions, over something I want. There was this man who wanted a boat more than anything. His wife was totally against the idea. So back and forth they went, arguing about buying this boat. He wanted this boat so badly, he went out and bought it without his wife's knowledge. How do you think that went over? She was livid. Well, I'll tell you what, he said to his wife, in the spirit of compromise, why don't you name the boat? And being a good sport, she accepted. The day came when she told her husband she named the boat, and he was excited to see what it was. And so he went down to the dock, he found his boat, and painted on the side of the boat, in big letters, was the name For Sale. She named it For Sale. I like that. Perhaps there's something in your life, perhaps there's something in my life that needs a for sale sign on it because there's too much of a hold on our lives. It's been said, that which you cannot give away, you do not possess, it possesses you. What are you holding on to so tightly that it now owns you? Look at the problem, the principle, and the parable. We need to come to the punchline, the point of it all. The point of it all here. The farmer had all his T's crossed. He had all his I's dotted. He'd be considered successful in the eyes of most because he had big barns full of grain and goods that would take care of him the rest of his life. There was one problem, however. He did not realize that this was his last day before eternity. See, you might be able to control your investments, but you cannot control your lifespan. His American dream turns into its worst nightmare. God says to this man, verse 20, he says, you fool. And he wasn't a fool because he was rich. He's not called a fool even because he planned ahead. What made him a fool? Well, verse 20 goes on to say, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? Now, it's interesting that the idea behind that word, demanded, is of paying back a loan. God had loaned him all the stuff. He's loaned us all the stuff. We got to pay back on that someday. So here's the payback for the farmer. How did he use the stuff given to him? He missed the point. You know, it's tragic that this farmer could not enjoy all that he had planned. But the greater tragedy, however, is not what he left behind, but what lay ahead. He will stand before his Maker empty-handed. Scripture says, naked a man comes from his mother's womb. Or as someone put it, we come into this world bare-bottomed and ballin'. And as he comes, so he departs. He takes nothing from his labor that he can carry in his hands. We leave with nothing in our hands. Jack Benny loved to say, if I can't take it with me, then I'm not going. Well, on December 26, 1974, Jack Benny left it all behind. You know the well-told story about John D. Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest men who ever lived. After he died, someone asked his accountant, "How much money did John D. leave?" The accountant's reply, "All of it." He left all of it. Colonel Sanders, founder of KFC, is right when he said there's no good reason to be the richest man in the cemetery. Jesus drives home the point when he says in verse 21, this is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself, but is not rich toward God. For himself. That's the problem. That's the tragedy. An older man comes upon a younger, ambitious man. He says, "And what do you plan on doing?" The younger man answers, I'm going to go to school, I'm going to get a degree, and I'm going to graduate from the university." The old man asks, "And then?" "Then I'm going to set up a business." The old man asks, "And then?" "Then I'm going to make my fortune." "And then?" "Well, I suppose I'll grow old, retire, and live on my money." "And then?" "And then?" We say, "I will, I will, I will," and the Lord to whom we must give an account asks, "And then?" "Well, Lord, I bought a lot of toys." "And then?" "I sure had a lot of fun." "And then?" "I was able to kind of kick back and take it easy while sipping my colada in the sunshine." "And then?" "Oh, you should see how good I am at my golf game." "And then?" "And then?" Now, it's safe to say that you don't want to waste your lives. I can assume that. It's safe to assume that you already know that the point of life is more about relationships than all the stuff, and more about that which outlasts us than what we possess. And if it's true that we do want to make our life count for God, then why do material things have such power to pull me away from what I know, I believe, and what I might even want? How is it that material things can have such a hold on our lives? Why is its grip so tight? Why do we keep falling for the lie that a little bit more will be enough? How do we win successfully over the intoxication with obtaining more and more? What is the antidote to greed? Well, it's found in 4 words at the end of verse 21. Not rich toward God. Not rich toward God. What does that look like? You might be thinking, well, here it is. This is where the pastor is going to talk about tithing. Let me disappoint you. I'm not going to talk about 10%. I'm not going to put any percentage on it. You have to work that out as to the percentage that is sacrificial for you. But instead, I will ask, are you rich toward God? It's all about what we really treasure. For that is where our heart will be, Jesus says in Matthew 6. A young man would get in his car every Friday night and drive 150 miles down a desolate desert road to another town where he would stay overnight, spend all day Saturday, and then drive back 150 miles to his own home. He did this every week for 2 years. Why? Why did he do this? Because he had a girlfriend in that city. His treasure was there, and he was committed to all that was involved in driving a 300-mile round trip every weekend to be with her. What do you treasure? What do I treasure? It's been said that when Christ ceases to fill the heart with satisfaction, our souls will go in silent search of other lovers. In other words, we all are desperately seeking something for inner satisfaction. Is the stuff doing it? Likely I've used this quote before by C.S. Lewis. I'm going to use it again. It would seem, he says, it would seem that our Lord finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling about with drink and sex and ambition when infinitely joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum, We are far too easily pleased. Amen to that. Don't think rich and poor. Don't think percentages. Don't think tithing. This isn't about tithing. We are far too easily pleased. We are far too easily pleased whenever we long for anything less than God. When we live as though our life does consist in the abundance of possessions, we will only discover that it is like a man dying of thirst, trying to satisfy that thirst by drinking salt water. The stuff can never quench it. The psalmist cried out, Psalm 63:1, "O God, you are my God. Earnestly I seek you. My soul thirsts for you." Psalm 42 says, "As the deer pants for living water, so my soul pants for you, O God. My soul thirsts for the living God." Don't be like the farmer who wasted all that was given to him on himself. Don't be like the farmer who was wise in his own eyes. Don't be like the farmer who hoarded it all. Be rich toward God. Are you rich toward God? Because everything else will take care of itself. Now, if you're taking notes, or if you want to grab a piece of paper at the bottom of those notes or somewhere on that paper, I want you to do this. I want you to write Luke 12:21 and then put a question mark next to it. Luke 12:21, question mark. And if you want to be even more bold, I grabbed this from someone else. If you want to be even more bold, put it on the cover of your checkbook or on your wallet or on your credit card or whatever you use for spending of your money. Luke 12:21, question mark. Because the question mark should remind you of the question every time we're spending something: will I be rich toward God? Pastor was invited to dinner in the home of a very wealthy man in Texas. After the meal, this man led the pastor to the place where they could get a good view of the surrounding area. And pointing to the oil wells punctuating the landscape, he boasted, 25 years ago, Pastor, I had nothing. Now, as far as you can see, it's all mine. Looking in the opposite direction at his sprawling fields of grain, he said, that's all mine. Turning east toward huge herds of cattle, he bragged, they're all mine. And pointing to the west, a beautiful forest, he exclaimed, this too is all mine. He paused, expecting the pastor to compliment him on his great success. The pastor, however, placed one hand on the man's shoulder and pointing heavenward with the other hand, he simply said, and how much do you have in that direction? Don't miss the point of life. Honor God with your success, your possessions, your resources. Make them count for eternity. Don't worship what you have. Worship God with what you have. Love Him so much. Pant after Him so much that you want to send it all ahead. So whatever God determines in your heart to send, you want to send it ahead, that you want to use what has been given to you for the souls of men and women, for the benefit of others, for making a difference for all of eternity. Let's be rich toward